Coming down the stairs, I heard a lot of laughter in the living room. My daughter-in-law was showing my house to a buyer. This house could hold mummies. They laughed. When I walked in, she confronted me. "You're already going to a nursing home. You don't run anything." I just replied, "You're going to rot in jail." The living room froze. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Janine, and at 62 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal life could throw at me. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in October when I heard the laughter. Not the warm, family kind of laughter that used to fill this house when my late husband was alive, but something sharper, colder. Something that made my stomach twist as I slowly descended the stairs, gripping the banister with hands that suddenly felt older than their years. The voices were coming from my living room. My living room, in my house, where I'd raised my son Nolan and created 30 years of memories. As I reached the bottom step, I could make out distinct voices through the archway. This house could hold mummies. The laughter that followed made my blood run cold. I stepped into the doorway and froze. There was my daughter-in-law, Harlow, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the morning light, gesturing dramatically at my vintage wallpaper to a middle-aged couple I'd never seen before. The woman was taking notes on her phone while the man measured the windows with his eyes like he was already planning renovations. "The bones are good," Harlow was saying, running her manicured finger along my antique mantelpiece like she owned it. "You could completely modernize this place. Tear down that wall, open up the kitchen, maybe add a master suite upstairs." My throat went dry. They were talking about my home like it was already theirs. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. All three heads turned toward me. The couple looked embarrassed, shifting uncomfortably. But Harlow's face didn't show even a flicker of shame. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and gave me that smile I'd learned to fear over the past 2 years since she married my son. "Oh, Janine," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I didn't expect you to be up so early." "This is my house," I said, finding my voice. "What are these people doing here?" The man cleared his throat. "We're the Hendersons. We were told this property was for sale." My legs nearly gave out. "For sale?" Harlow stepped between me and the couple, her smile never wavering. "I'm so sorry," she said to them, lowering her voice just enough that I had to strain to hear. "She gets confused sometimes. The family is handling all the arrangements." The humiliation hit me like a physical blow. She was talking about me like I wasn't even there, like I was some senile old woman who didn't understand what was happening in her own home. "I am not confused," I said, my voice getting stronger. "This is my house, and I did not put it up for sale." Harlow's mask slipped for just a second, and I saw something ugly flash in her green eyes. Then she was all sympathy again, turning back to the Hendersons. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation another time," she suggested, "when things are more settled." As the couple gathered their things and headed for the door, I heard the woman whisper to her husband, "Poor thing. It's so sad when they lose their grip on reality." The front door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Harlow turned to face me, and now there was no pretense of kindness in her expression. "Sit down, Janine," she said, her voice flat and businesslike. "In my own living room?" I shot back, but I was shaking now, the full reality of what had just happened starting to sink in. "You're already going to a nursing home," Harlow said matter-of-factly, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her designer blouse. "You don't run anything anymore. Nolan and I are making the decisions now." The words hit me like ice water. A nursing home? When had this been decided? How had this been decided without me? "Where is my son?" I demanded. "At work, where responsible adults go during the day," Harlow replied. "Don't worry, he knows all about this. He signed the paperwork yesterday." I felt the room start to spin. Nolan had signed paperwork? My own son had agreed to sell my house and put me in a nursing home without even discussing it with me? "You can't do this," I whispered. Harlow pulled out her phone and began typing, not even bothering to look at me. "Actually, we can. You see, Nolan has power of attorney now. I helped him understand that you're not capable of making these kinds of decisions anymore. Power of attorney. The words echoed in my head like a death sentence. When had my son gotten power of attorney? When had I supposedly become incompetent? The nursing home is very nice, Harlow continued conversationally, still focused on her phone. Sunset Manor. I picked it out myself. They have activities and everything. Bingo on Wednesdays. Sunset Manor. I knew that place. It was the cheapest facility in town, the one where people went to be forgotten, the one where my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had died last year after her family dumped her there. I'm not going anywhere, I said, surprised by the steel that had crept into my voice. For the first time since the Hendersons left, Harlow looked directly at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my blood turn to ice. She wasn't just planning to get rid of me, she was enjoying it. Oh, but you are, she said softly. The papers are already signed. Your room is already reserved. The moving truck comes next week. That's when the rage hit me. Pure, white-hot fury that burned away the shock and fear and confusion. This woman, this stranger who had married my son 2 years ago, thought she could just erase me. Thought she could take my life, my home, my dignity, and package it all up with a neat little bow. I looked at her standing in my living room, in the house where I'd nursed my husband through his final illness, where I'd celebrated my son's graduation, where I'd planned to live out my remaining years in peace. And I smiled. You know what, Harlow? I said, my voice perfectly calm now. You're going to rot in jail. The silence that followed was deafening. Harlow's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor my husband had installed with his own hands 40 years ago. Her face went completely white. What did you say? You heard me. I was still smiling, and I could see it was unnerving her. Good. Let her be unnerved. Let her wonder what I knew. Because the truth was, I knew a lot more than she realized. A lot more than anyone realized. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving her standing there in shock. Behind me, I heard her scrambling to pick up her phone, her breathing quick and shallow. Janine, she called after me. What do you mean by that? Janine. But I didn't answer. I had phone calls to make and plans to set in motion. Harlow thought she was so clever, but she had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated me completely, and now she was about to learn exactly what that mistake would cost her. The sound of Harlow's heels clicking frantically on the hardwood floors followed me into the kitchen, but I didn't turn around. I needed a moment to collect myself, to process what had just happened and figure out my next move. 3 months. That's how long this had been building, and I'd been too blind to see it. It started small, like these things always do. Harlow suggesting that I looked tired, that maybe I should rest more. Nolan mentioning that he worried about me living alone in such a big house. Little comments about my forgetfulness, my confusion, my declining health. Except I wasn't forgetful. I wasn't confused, and my health was fine. Janine, we need to talk. Harlow's voice was sharp now, the fake sweetness completely gone. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made earlier, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. There's nothing to talk about, dear. You've made your intentions perfectly clear. Look, I know you're upset, but this is for your own good. She was trying to regain control, to sound reasonable. Nolan and I have been worried about you for months. I turned to face her, leaning against the counter that had been my command center for decades. Worried about what exactly? Your episodes. Harlow perched on the edge of one of my kitchen chairs, like she was afraid to fully commit to sitting down. The confusion, the forgetfulness. Last week you left the stove on all night. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. I came over that morning and found it still burning. You could have burned the house down. I stared at her, and pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even realized existed began clicking into place. You were here that morning when I wasn't home. I was at my doctor's appointment. Well, yes, but... And somehow you found the stove on in an empty house. I set my coffee cup down carefully. How interesting. A flush crept up Harlow's neck, but she pushed forward. And what about the bills? You forgot to pay the electric bill last month. And your phone bill. Nolan had to take care of everything. I've never missed a bill payment in 40 years. You're getting older, Janine. These things happen. But they didn't happen. Not to me. I'd always been meticulous about my bills, my schedule, my responsibilities. It was how I'd managed to keep this house running after my husband died, how I'd built a comfortable nest egg for my retirement. "Where's the paperwork?" I asked suddenly. "What paperwork?" "The power of attorney documents. I want to see what I supposedly signed." Harlow shifted uncomfortably. "Nolan has all of that at his office." "Of course he does." I moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden my husband and I had planted together. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, but nothing would ever be the same again. "Tell me something, Harlow. How long have you been planning this?" "Planning what?" "Janine, you're being paranoid." I laughed, and the sound was harsh even to my own ears. "Paranoid?" "My daughter-in-law just showed my house to potential buyers without telling me, informed me I'm being shipped off to a nursing home, and claims my son signed papers giving her control over my life. And I'm paranoid? Not her. Us. Nolan and I are making these decisions together." "Right. Of course." I turned back to face her. "And where exactly is my loving son today, while you're handling the sale of his childhood home?" "He's at work. He has a conference call with Tokyo." That was probably true. Nolan's job at the engineering firm kept him busy, often working odd hours to accommodate international clients. It was one of the things Harlow had used against him from the beginning, making him feel guilty about not being around enough to help with me. "He feels terrible about this," Harlow continued, apparently sensing an opening. "But he knows it's necessary. You can't live alone anymore, Janine. What if something happens? What if you fall, or have a medical emergency, or leave the stove on mysteriously when I'm not even home?" Her mouth snapped shut. I'd caught her. We both knew it. But instead of backing down, something calculating flickered in her eyes. "I think you're more confused than we realized," she said slowly. "Maybe we need to move up the timeline." A chill ran down my spine. "What timeline?" "For your move to Sunset Manor. I was thinking next week, but maybe it should be sooner. Tomorrow even. I'll call them this afternoon." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. She was talking about dismantling my entire life like she was rearranging furniture. "You can't do this," I whispered. "I can, and I will." Harlow stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Nolan trusts me to handle this situation, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." "Nolan doesn't know what you're really doing. Nolan knows exactly what I'm doing. He asked me to handle it because he couldn't bear to do it himself. He loves you too much to be objective about your condition." My condition. As if declining mental health was a foregone conclusion instead of a fiction she'd carefully constructed. "Why?" I asked. "Why are you doing this to me?" For just a moment, her mask slipped completely. The fake concern, the pretend reluctance, the manufactured sympathy, all of it vanished, leaving behind something cold and calculating. "Because I can," she said simply. And there it was, the truth underneath all the lies and manipulation. She was doing this because she could get away with it. Because she'd identified me as an obstacle to whatever life she wanted with my son, and she'd decided to remove me. "The house will sell for at least $400,000, she continued, almost conversationally. "Maybe more if we find the right buyer. That's a nice nest egg for Nolan and me to start our real life together." "Our real life? You've been married for 2 years. Our real life without his mother hovering over everything." The venom in her voice was unmistakable now. "Do you have any idea what it's like being married to a man who calls his mommy every other day? Who rushes over here every weekend to check on you? Who feels guilty every time we go on vacation because he's leaving poor Janine all alone?" So that was it. I wasn't just an inconvenience. I was competition. In Harlow's mind, I was standing between her and complete control over my son. "Nolan loves me," I said quietly. "Nolan feels obligated to you. There's a difference." She picked up her purse from the counter, checking her reflection in the chrome surface of my refrigerator. "But don't worry. Once you're settled at Sunset Manor, he'll visit sometimes. Holidays, probably. Maybe your birthday." The casual dismissal of a lifetime of love and sacrifice hit me like a slap. This woman truly believed she could erase me from my son's life as easily as she was erasing me from my home. "I'll fight this," I said. "With what? You have no money of your own anymore. It's all in joint accounts with Nolan now, remember?" No legal standing since you're mentally incompetent. No allies since everyone can see how confused you've become lately. She paused at the kitchen doorway, looking back at me with something that might have been pity if it weren't so calculating. Face facts, Janine. You've already lost. The front door slammed behind her, leaving me alone in the kitchen where I'd made countless meals for my family, where I'd comforted my son through broken hearts and celebrated his achievements. But as I stood there in the silence, surrounded by 40 years of memories, I realized something that Harlow hadn't counted on. She was absolutely right about one thing. I had been planning, but not for a nursing home. I'd been planning for her, and she had just given me everything I needed to destroy her completely. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I needed. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Detective Morrison? It's Janine Fletcher. I think it's time we had that conversation we discussed. The game was about to change, and Harlow had no idea what was coming. Detective Morrison arrived within an hour, just as I knew he would. We'd been neighbors for 15 years before his promotion moved him across town, and he'd always been the kind of man who kept his word. Janine, he said, settling his large frame into my husband's old recliner. When you called 6 months ago about running background checks, I thought you might be overreacting. Now I'm thinking maybe you weren't. I poured him coffee in the mug I'd always kept for his visits, the one with world's best neighbor that his daughter had given me one Christmas. Some traditions die hard, even when the world is falling apart around you. Tell me what you found, I said, though I already knew most of it. What I needed was confirmation, official documentation, proof that would hold up when this whole mess exploded. Rick Morrison had been a detective for 23 years, and his expression told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. Your instincts were right, Janine. Harlow Chen, or rather the woman calling herself Harlow Chen, has a history. My hands were steady as I set down my coffee cup, but my heart was racing. 6 months ago, something about my new daughter-in-law had felt wrong. Not obviously wrong, not dramatically wrong, just off. Little things that didn't add up, stories that changed slightly each time she told them, gaps in her past that she glossed over with that bright smile. So I'd done what any protective mother would do. I'd asked questions, and when the questions didn't yield answers, I'd called in a favor. What kind of history? I asked, though I was bracing myself for the answer. Rick pulled out a manila folder, the kind that had become all too familiar over the past months. She's done this before, Janine. 3 times that we can confirm, possibly more. 3 times. The number hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd suspected something like this. The first was in Phoenix, Arizona, about 8 years ago. Married a widower named Robert Chen. That's where she got the last name she's using now. Robert was 74, had early-stage dementia. Harlow convinced his family that he needed full-time care, got herself appointed as his healthcare proxy, and moved him into a memory care facility. What happened to him? Died 18 months later. Natural causes, but the timing was convenient. By then, she'd sold his house, liquidated his investments, and transferred most of his assets into accounts she controlled. The family tried to fight it, but the legal documentation was solid. She walked away with nearly $300,000. I felt sick. This wasn't just greed, this was a pattern, a calculated, practiced method of destroying lives. The second case was in Denver, Rick continued. Married a man named James Wright, 58 years old, recently divorced. He had an elderly mother living with him. Sound familiar? Within 6 months of the marriage, Harlow had convinced James that his mother was becoming a burden. The mother, Eleanor Wright, was moved to a care facility against her will, and Eleanor died 6 months later. Heart attack, brought on by stress and depression, according to the medical examiner. But here's the interesting part. Harlow had already filed paperwork to become Eleanor's guardian, claiming the woman was mentally incompetent. The parallels to my own situation were chilling. Every detail matched what Harlow was trying to do to me, down to the claims of mental incompetence and the rush to move me out of my home. What about the third case? Rick's expression grew even grimmer. Portland, Oregon. This one's different because we have a living witness. Harlow married David Kim, 43 years old, software engineer. His grandmother lived with them, 91 years old, sharp as a tack despite her age. Let me guess. Suddenly, grandmother became a problem. Exactly. But this time, the family fought back. David's sister got suspicious when Harlow started talking about nursing homes and memory care. She hired a private investigator, discovered Harlow's real history, and confronted her. What happened? Harlow disappeared in the middle of the night, cleaned out the joint bank accounts, took everything of value that wasn't nailed down, and vanished. David never saw her again, but she'd already done significant financial damage. The family lost about $50,000, plus legal fees trying to track her down. I sat back in my chair, processing the magnitude of what Rick was telling me. This wasn't just about me. Harlow was a predator who specialized in targeting families with elderly members, exploiting love and guilt and family loyalty to get what she wanted. There's more, Rick said quietly. More? We think she's been using different names, different identities. The woman your son married as Harlow Chen? Her real name appears to be Helen Crawford, born in Michigan, 34 years old. She has a juvenile record, sealed, but I have a contact who was able to give me some details off the record, 34. Harlow had told Nolan she was 29, just another lie in what was apparently a lifetime of deception. What kind of juvenile record? Elder abuse. When she was 17, she was caught stealing from the nursing home where she worked part-time. Not just money. She was taking medications, jewelry, anything valuable she could get her hands on. The charges were dropped when she agreed to counseling and community service, but the pattern was already there. I thought about all the times Harlow had visited me over the past 2 years, how she'd wandered through my house, commenting on my antiques, my jewelry, my late husband's watch collection. I'd thought she was just making conversation, showing interest in family history. Now I realized she'd been cataloging assets. Rick, there's something else you need to know, I said. She's already started the process. She showed my house to buyers this morning. She claims Nolan signed power of attorney papers, and that I'm going to Sunset Manor next week. His face darkened. Have you seen these papers? No. She says Nolan has them at his office. Janine, listen to me very carefully. If those papers exist, and if they're legitimate, you need to act fast. Once you're moved to a care facility, especially one like Sunset Manor, it becomes much harder to fight these things. The system is designed to protect vulnerable elderly people, but it can also be used against them. What do you mean? If Harlow has convinced medical professionals that you're mentally incompetent, if she has documentation of concerning behaviors or incidents, a judge might uphold the guardianship even if you object. Your objections could be seen as further evidence of your declining mental state. The trap was even more sophisticated than I'd realized. Every staged incident, every manufactured emergency, every carefully documented episode had been building toward this moment when my own words would be used as evidence against me. But we have her history now, I said. Surely that changes things. It helps, but it's not enough. We need proof that she's actively defrauding you, not just evidence that she's done it before. We need to catch her in the act. I smiled for the first time since this nightmare began. What if I told you I've been recording every conversation we've had for the past 3 months? Rick's eyebrows shot up. Every conversation? Every single one. I started wearing a small digital recorder after that incident with the stove. I wanted to document my interactions with her in case my memory was actually starting to go. I paused. Turns out, my memory is just fine. But I have hours of audio of Harlow discussing her plans for me, talking about how much money the house will bring, even joking about how easy it is to manipulate Nolan. Janine, that's... Rick shook his head in amazement. That's exactly what we need. But there's something else we should discuss. Something bigger. Bigger how? I did some checking on Sunset Manor, the facility where she wants to place you. They've had an unusually high number of deaths in the past 2 years. Natural causes, all of them. But the pattern is concerning. Most of the residents who died had their assets transferred to family members shortly before their deaths. A chill ran down my spine. You think she's working with someone there? I think Harlow Chen, or Helen Crawford, or whatever her real name is, has connections we haven't uncovered yet. And I think you stumbling onto this might have prevented something much worse than just losing your house. The weight of what he was saying settled over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about greed or convenience. This was about something darker, more systematic. What do we do now? I asked. Rick leaned forward, his expression serious but determined. Now we set a trap, and this time, we make sure she can't disappear in the middle of the night. I thought about Nolan, my sweet boy who had no idea he'd married a monster. I thought about all the other families Harlow had destroyed, all the elderly people who'd died alone and forgotten because of her schemes. Tell me what you need me to do, I said. Because this wasn't just about saving myself anymore. This was about stopping a predator who had been hunting vulnerable families for years. And I was going to make sure her hunting days were finally over. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with the kind of clarity that comes from finally understanding the full scope of what you're fighting. Rick had left me with homework, specific things to look for, questions to ask, ways to draw Harlow out without making her suspicious. But as I sat at my kitchen table with my morning coffee, staring at the folder of documents Rick had left behind, I realized there was something we'd missed. Something that had been nagging at me since yesterday's conversation. Harlow Chen, Helen Crawford, the woman who'd married my son, had been using different names, different identities. But what if she hadn't just been changing her name? What if she'd been changing her entire legal status? I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 20 years. Margie, it's Janine Fletcher. I know it's early, but I need a favor. Margaret Williams had been my best friend since high school, and she'd spent the last 30 years working in the county clerk's office. If anyone could help me dig into marriage records across multiple states, it was Margie. Janine, what on earth has you calling at 6 in the morning? I need you to run some marriage license searches for me. Multiple states, multiple names. It's important, Margie. More important than I can explain over the phone. There was a pause. Margie had always been able to read between the lines, even when we were teenagers. This is about that daughter-in-law of yours, isn't it? The one you've been worried about? How did you— Honey, I've known you for 50 years. You don't ask for favors unless something's seriously wrong. What do you need me to look for? I gave her the names Rick had uncovered, Harlow Chen, Helen Crawford, along with the approximate dates and locations of her previous marriages. What I was hoping to find was evidence of a pattern. What I found was something much worse. Margie called me back 2 hours later, her voice tight with concern. Janine, you need to sit down for this. I was already sitting, but I gripped the edge of my kitchen table anyway. What did you find? Your daughter-in-law is still married, not to Nolan, to at least 2 other men, maybe more. The room seemed to tilt around me. What do you mean still married? I mean, she never divorced David Kim in Portland, or James Wright in Denver. According to the records I can access, she's legally married to 3 different men in 3 different states. Bigamy. The word hit me like a thunderbolt. Not only was Harlow a predator who targeted vulnerable families, she was also committing felony bigamy on a multi-state level. Margie, are you absolutely certain about this? I triple-checked everything. The marriage license between Helen Crawford and David Kim was filed in Multnomah County, Oregon, on March 15, 2019. No record of divorce. The marriage between Harlow Chen and James Wright was recorded in Denver County, Colorado, on September 2, 2020. Also no record of divorce. And her marriage to my son? December 10, 2022, right here in our county, which means she was already married to 2 other men when she walked down the aisle with Nolan. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My son's marriage was invalid. Everything Harlow had claimed about being his wife, about having legal authority to make decisions, all of it was built on a foundation of lies. There's more, Margie continued. I found another marriage record, this one going back further. A Helen Crawford married Robert Chen in Maricopa County, Arizona, in 2014. He died in 2016, but get this, there's no record of her changing her name legally after his death. She just started using his last name. So Harlow Chen isn't even her legal name. Legally, she's still Helen Crawford. Has been this whole time. I thanked Margie and hung up, my mind racing. This was huge, bigger than Rick and I had imagined. This wasn't just fraud. This was a systematic pattern of bigamy spanning multiple states in nearly a decade. But as I sat there processing this information, I realized something else. Knowledge was power, but timing was everything. If I revealed this too soon, Harlow might disappear again like she had in Portland. If I waited too long, she might succeed in having me declared incompetent and committed. I needed to think strategically. The first thing I did was call Rick Morrison and fill him in on what Margie had discovered. His reaction was immediate and intense. "Janine, this changes everything. Bigamy is a federal crime when it crosses state lines. We're not just talking about elder abuse anymore. We're talking about wire fraud, mail fraud, potentially tax evasion. The FBI is going to be very interested in Helen Crawford. But what about the immediate situation? She's still planning to move me to that nursing home. We use this to our advantage. We let her think her plan is working while we build our case. How much time do we have? She said the moving truck comes next week. But yesterday she threatened to move up the timeline. Okay, here's what we're going to do. You're going to act like you're resigned to the situation. Don't fight her anymore. Don't ask questions. Let her think she's won. Meanwhile, I'm going to coordinate with the FBI and the district attorney's office. We're going to set up surveillance, document everything. And when we move, we're going to make sure she can't wiggle out of this. What if she tries to move me before then? She won't. Think about it. She needs time to finalize the house sale, transfer assets, cover her tracks. Moving you too quickly would raise red flags with the nursing home, with your son, with anyone who might ask questions later. She's going to stick to her timeline because it's the safest approach. After I hung up with Rick, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about my next move. I had the truth now, all of it. But the truth alone wasn't enough. I needed to be smarter than Harlow had been, more careful, more strategic. That's when I remembered the safety deposit box. 25 years ago, when my husband was diagnosed with his heart condition, we'd set up a safety deposit box at First National Bank. It contained our important documents, some jewelry, and other valuables we wanted to keep secure. After he died, I'd continued to pay the annual fee, but I hadn't been to the box in years. Until today. I drove to the bank, my hands steady on the wheel despite the magnitude of what I was planning. The safety deposit box was exactly as I'd left it, filled with documents and mementos from a lifetime of careful planning. But today, I was adding something new. I pulled out a small digital recorder, the same one I'd been using to document my conversations with Harlow, and set it carefully inside the box. Along with it, I placed copies of all the evidence Rick had gathered, Margie's marriage record searches, and a detailed letter explaining everything I'd discovered about Helen Crawford's criminal history. If something happened to me, if Harlow's plan succeeded and I ended up in Sunset Manor unable to defend myself, this evidence would still exist. Rick knew about the safety deposit box now, and he had explicit instructions to access it if I became incapacitated. But I wasn't planning to become incapacitated. I was planning something much different. As I drove home, I called Nolan's office. His secretary put me through immediately. "Mom, is everything okay? Harlow said you've been having some difficulties lately." The concern in my son's voice broke my heart. He had no idea that the woman he'd married was a predator, that their entire relationship was built on lies, that she'd been planning to destroy our family from the moment she walked into our lives. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I was just calling to see if you'd like to come to dinner on Sunday. It's been too long since we had a real conversation." "That sounds great, Mom. I'll check with Harlow about our schedule." "Actually," I said carefully, "I was hoping it could just be the two of us. Like when you were growing up. We could make that pot roast you always loved." There was a pause. "Mom, Harlow and I are married now. We do things together." "Of course. I just thought it might be nice to have some one-on-one time with my son. But if Harlow wants to come, she's welcome. Let me talk to her and get back to you." After I hung up, I realized I was smiling for the first time in days, because I knew exactly what Harlow's response would be. She wouldn't want Nolan having private conversations with me. Not now, when she was so close to achieving her goal. She'd find a way to be there, to monitor every word, to make sure I didn't say anything that might undermine her carefully constructed narrative, which was exactly what I was counting on, because Sunday dinner was going to be very interesting indeed. I was going to give Harlow exactly what she wanted, the appearance of a confused, defeated old woman who was ready to accept her fate. Right up until the moment I destroyed her completely, the trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for her to walk into it. Sunday dinner arrived with all the anticipation of a storm about to break. I'd spent 3 days preparing, not just the pot roast and mashed potatoes that Nolan loved, but the careful orchestration of what would be the most important conversation of my life. They arrived at 5 o'clock sharp, Harlow's hand possessively wrapped around my son's arm as if she were afraid he might escape. She was dressed casually but expensively, her blonde hair perfectly styled even for a family dinner, the picture of domestic perfection. "Something smells wonderful, Mom," Nolan said, giving me a hug that felt different somehow. More careful, more distant. I could see Harlow's influence in the way he held himself, the slight hesitation before he embraced me. "Just your old favorite," I replied, forcing warmth into my voice. "Why don't you two sit down while I finish up in the kitchen?" As I bustled around preparing the final touches, I could hear them talking quietly in the dining room. Harlow's voice was too low for me to make out words, but her tone was soothing, reassuring, no doubt reinforcing whatever story she'd been telling him about my declining mental state. When I carried the roast to the table, Nolan jumped up to help me, his engineer's instincts kicking in. "Mom, you should have called. This looks heavy. I've been carrying roast to this table for 40 years, sweetheart. I think I can manage one more." But I let him help anyway, noting how Harlow watched our interaction with sharp eyes. She was cataloging everything, looking for signs of the confusion and frailty she'd been claiming I exhibited. The first part of dinner passed normally. We talked about Nolan's work, a project he was excited about involving bridge construction in South America. I asked questions, remembered details from previous conversations, demonstrated the sharp memory that Harlow had supposedly witnessed deteriorating. I could see her growing uncomfortable with how lucid I appeared, how engaged I was with the conversation. This wasn't the confused, declining woman she'd been describing to my son. "Mom," Nolan said as I served dessert, his favorite apple pie. "Harlow and I wanted to talk to you about some changes we think would be good for you." Here it was, the moment I'd been preparing for. "What kind of changes, dear?" Harlow leaned forward, her expression carefully composed into what she probably thought looked like loving concern. "We've been worried about you living alone in this big house, Janine. Nolan barely sleeps at night thinking about what could happen if you fell or had some kind of emergency." I turned to my son, letting just a hint of confusion creep into my voice. "You're worried about me." "Of course I am, Mom. You're 72 years old." 62, I corrected automatically. "Right, 62, and this house is getting to be too much for you to maintain. Plus, there have been some incidents lately that have us concerned." "Incidents?" Harlow's carefully manufactured evidence of my declining competence. "What incidents?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he was referring to. Harlow pulled out her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be notes. "Well, there was the stove incident last week. I came by and found it still burning from the night before." "I don't remember that," I said, which was true, because it had never happened. "And the bills," Nolan added. "You forgot to pay your electric and phone bills last month. I had to take care of them for you." Also untrue. My bills were automatically debited from my account and had been for years, but I could see how easily she'd convinced him otherwise. "The thing is, Mom," Nolan continued, his voice gentle but firm, "Harlow found a really nice place where you'd have people around all the time, activities, medical care if you need it. It's called Sunset Manor." "A nursing home?" I let my voice quaver just slightly. "An assisted living facility," Harlow corrected quickly. "Very nice, very comfortable. You'd have your own room, meals provided, housekeeping. No more worrying about maintenance or bills or any of that stressful stuff. But this is my home," I said, looking around the dining room where we'd celebrated so many milestones. "Your father and I bought this house when you were just a baby, Nolan. All our memories are here. I know, Mom, and we're not talking about getting rid of anything important. We'll keep all the family photos, the special pieces, but the house itself, it's just too much. We've already had it appraised, Harlow added. It should sell for around $400,000, maybe more. That money can go into an account for your care. Make sure you're comfortable for the rest of your life. An account she would control, no doubt, just like she'd done with her previous victims. Have you found buyers already? I asked innocently. Harlow and Nolan exchanged a look. Actually, Harlow said, we've had some interest. There's a couple who looked at it earlier this week. They seem very excited about it. The Hendersons, the couple she'd brought through my house while I was out, the ones who'd talked about tearing down walls and modernizing everything. That was fast, I observed. Well, it's a seller's market right now, Harlow said smoothly. Good houses go quickly. I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. And when would this all happen? Soon, Nolan said. We've already put a deposit down at Sunset Manor. They have a room available, and honestly, Mom, the waiting list is usually pretty long. We were lucky to get you in. Lucky. Or Harlow had connections there, just like Rick suspected. I see, I said quietly. And I suppose you've already made all the arrangements? We've handled the paperwork, Harlow said. Nolan has power of attorney now, so he can take care of all the legal details. You don't have to worry about any of that complicated stuff. Power of attorney, the documents I'd never signed, the authority I'd never granted. Could I see these papers? I asked. I'd like to understand what I'm agreeing to. Another exchange of looks between them. Mom, the important thing is that you trust us to take care of you, Nolan said. The legal details are, well, they're pretty boring. Lots of lawyer language. But surely I should know what rights I'm signing away. You're not signing away any rights, Harlow said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. We're just making sure you're protected and cared for. I stood up slowly, as if the weight of their words was too much for me to bear sitting down. This is a lot to process, I said. I think I need some air. I walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden my husband and I had planted together. Behind me, I could hear Nolan and Harlow talking in low voices. She's taking it better than I expected, Harlow was saying. She seems more confused than usual tonight, Nolan replied. Maybe you're right about the timeline. When I turned back to them, I was holding my phone. There's something I need to tell you both, I said. What is it, Mom? I hit the play button on my voice recorder app. Harlow's voice filled the dining room, crystal clear and unmistakably cruel. Because I can. The house will sell for at least $400,000. Maybe more if we find the right buyer. That's a nice nest egg for Nolan and me to start our real life together. Our real life without his mother hovering over everything. The color drained from Harlow's face. Nolan looked confused, then shocked as he recognized his wife's voice. What is this? Harlow demanded. This is you, 3 days ago, explaining to me why you're destroying my life, I said calmly. Would you like to hear more? I have hours of recordings. I hit play again. This time it was Harlow's voice saying, Face facts, Janine. You've already lost. You have no money of your own anymore. No legal standing. No allies. Nolan was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. Harlow, what is she talking about? It's taken out of context, Harlow said quickly. She's confused, Nolan. This is exactly what we've been talking about. She's paranoid, recording conversations, making up stories. Making up stories? I reached into the drawer of my china cabinet and pulled out the folder Rick had given me. Like the story about your real name being Helen Crawford? Or the story about your previous marriages to David Kim and James Wright and Robert Chen? Now Harlow looked genuinely terrified. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking about the fact that you're still married to at least 2 other men, which makes your marriage to my son invalid. I'm talking about the fact that you've done this exact same thing to 3 other families. I'm talking about the fact that Helen Crawford is a predator who specializes in targeting elderly family members. Nolan was looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match, trying to process what he was hearing. "This is insane," Harlow said, standing up so quickly that her chair fell backward. "Nolan, she's having some kind of psychotic break. We need to call someone." "Sit down," I said, and there was something in my voice that made her freeze. "We're not done." I pulled out my phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before Rick Morrison answered. "Detective Morrison, it's time." Within 10 minutes, my dining room was full of law enforcement officers. Rick Morrison, 2 FBI agents, and a representative from the district attorney's office. They'd been waiting for my call, positioned nearby in case Harlow tried to run. "Helen Crawford," one of the FBI agents said, "you're under arrest for bigamy, wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse." As they read her rights, Harlow looked at me with pure hatred. "You think you've won," she hissed, "but you've just destroyed your relationship with your son forever." I looked at Nolan, who was sitting in stunned silence as his world collapsed around him. "Maybe," I said, "but at least he'll be alive to hate me." Which is more than I can say for Robert Chen, James Wright, and Eleanor Wright. As they led Harlow away in handcuffs, she was still screaming about how this was all a misunderstanding, how I was a confused old woman who didn't know what she was talking about. But the evidence spoke for itself. And for the first time in months, my home was truly mine again. The silence after the FBI agents left was deafening. Nolan sat at my dining room table, staring at the spot where his wife had been sitting just 20 minutes earlier, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "She's been lying to me for 2 years, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know, sweetheart." I sat down beside him, resisting the urge to reach out and comfort him the way I had when he was a child. This was different. This was a grown man confronting the fact that his entire marriage had been built on deception. "The power of attorney papers," he said suddenly, looking up at me with haunted eyes. "I never signed any power of attorney papers, Mom. She kept saying we needed to get them done, but every time we made an appointment with a lawyer, something would come up. She'd reschedule or say we should wait until after her next doctor's appointment or she'd manufacture some crisis that required your immediate attention." I finished for him. He nodded slowly. "The stove incident. When she called me at work, hysterical, saying she'd found the house filled with gas and you were nowhere to be found. I rushed over here, but you were just at your book club meeting, which I told her about 3 days earlier," I said. "She knew exactly where I was." "And the bills. She showed me notices from the electric company, said you were getting confused about payments. I offered to set up automatic payments for you, but she said it would be better if I just handled everything myself." The pieces were falling into place for him now, the carefully constructed web of lies that Harlow had spun around both of us. I could see the anger building behind his eyes, replacing the shock. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I started suspecting something 6 months ago. Nothing dramatic, just little things that didn't add up." Her stories about her past changed depending on who she was talking to. She claimed to be an only child, but let slip once about a sister. Said she'd never been married before, but had a tan line where a wedding ring used to be. "Why didn't you tell me?" It was the question I'd been dreading, but also the one I'd prepared for. "Because I knew you wouldn't believe me. You were in love with her, or at least with the person you thought she was. If I'd come to you with suspicions and accusations, what would you have done?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him thinking back over the past 2 years, reevaluating every interaction through this new lens. "I would have thought you were jealous," he admitted finally. "I would have thought you couldn't accept that I was married and didn't need you anymore." "Exactly. So I did what any mother would do. I investigated quietly, gathered evidence, and waited for the right moment to act." "You could have been killed," he said suddenly, the full implications hitting him. "If she's done this before, if people have died, but I wasn't killed, and now she can't hurt anyone else." Over the next few weeks, the full scope of Harlow's crimes began to emerge. The FBI's investigation revealed that her real name was indeed Helen Crawford, and that she'd been running variations of the same con for over a decade. There were more victims than even Rick had initially discovered. elderly people who'd died under suspicious circumstances, families who'd been financially devastated, adult children who'd been manipulated into betraying their own parents. Sunset Manor, the facility where Harlow had planned to place me, was shut down pending investigation. The FBI had found evidence of systematic abuse and financial exploitation of residents, with Harlow as a key coordinator in the scheme. The thought of how close I'd come to ending up there still made my blood run cold. Nolan threw himself into helping with the investigation, providing financial records and communications that helped establish the pattern of Harlow's fraud. I think it was his way of processing the betrayal, of trying to make amends for the role he'd unknowingly played in her plan. I transferred $15,000 to her personal account last month, he told me one evening as we sat in my living room going through bank statements. She said it was for a down payment on a vacation home she wanted to surprise me with. That money probably went to pay off debts from her previous scams, I said gently. None of this is your fault, Nolan. She's a professional manipulator. This is what she does. But I could see the guilt eating at him. The knowledge that he'd been prepared to commit his own mother to a facility where she might have died alone and forgotten. 3 months after Harlow's arrest, we were both called to testify at her trial. The courtroom was packed with victims and their families, people who'd traveled from across the country to see justice served. When it was my turn to take the stand, I looked directly at Harlow as I spoke. She was thinner than before, her perfect blonde hair dulled by months in jail, her designer clothes replaced by an orange jumpsuit. But her eyes still held that calculating coldness I'd learned to recognize. She told me I had already lost, I said, repeating her words from that day in my kitchen. She said I had no money, no legal standing, no allies. She thought she had isolated me completely. But that wasn't true, was it? The prosecutor asked. No, I said, smiling for the first time since I'd entered the courtroom. What she didn't understand was that I had something she'd never had and never would have. What was that? People who genuinely loved me. Detective Morrison, who went above and beyond to help a neighbor in trouble. My friend Margie, who spent hours searching records to uncover the truth. My son, who once he understood what was really happening, stood by me completely. I paused, looking at Nolan in the gallery. Helen Crawford has spent her life using people and throwing them away. She couldn't comprehend that some relationships are built on something stronger than what you can take from each other. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. As the bailiff led her away, Harlow turned to look at me one last time. I thought she might try to say something, to get in one final cruel word. Instead, she just looked defeated. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked like what she really was, a sad, empty person who'd built her entire life on destroying others. The drive home from the courthouse was quiet. Nolan had offered to take me to dinner to celebrate, but I'd declined. What I wanted was to go home, to my house, to the space that was truly mine again. Mom, Nolan said as we pulled into my driveway, I know I have a lot to make up for. I know saying I'm sorry isn't enough. You don't have anything to make up for, I said firmly. You were the victim here too. She manipulated you just as much as she tried to manipulate me. But I was ready to put you in that place. I was ready to sell your house, to take away everything that mattered to you. But you didn't, I pointed out. When you learned the truth, you stood by me. That's what matters. He walked me to the door, and I could see him looking around the house with new eyes. The home he'd been prepared to sell was still here, still filled with 40 years of family memories. Can I ask you something? He said as I unlocked the front door. Of course. How did you know? I mean, really know, not just suspect. How did you know she was lying about everything? I thought about it for a moment, trying to put into words something that had been more instinct than logic. She never asked about your father, I said finally. What do you mean? In 2 years of marriage, she never once asked me about your father. She never wanted to hear stories about your childhood, about what you were like as a little boy, about the man who helped raise you. Someone who truly loves you would want to know those things. Someone who was just using you wouldn't care. Nolan nodded slowly. understanding dawning in his eyes. Besides, I added with a smile, she made one critical mistake. What was that? She underestimated a mother's love, and she underestimated me. 6 months later, I was hosting Sunday dinner again, not just for Nolan, but for Rick Morrison and his wife, for Margie and her husband, for the neighbors who'd rallied around me during the trial. My dining room was full of laughter and conversation, the kind of warm, genuine connection that Harlow had never understood and never would. As I looked around the table at these people who'd stood by me, who'd helped me fight for my life and my home, I realized something profound. Harlow had been right about one thing. I had lost something during this ordeal. I'd lost my naivety. I'd lost the assumption that family members always have your best interests at heart. I'd lost the belief that evil always announces itself dramatically. But what I'd gained was so much more valuable. I'd gained the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. I'd gained a deeper appreciation for the people who truly loved me. And I'd gained the satisfaction of knowing that a predator who'd hurt countless families would never hurt anyone again. At 62, I was starting a new chapter of my life. Not in a nursing home, not as someone's victim, but as a woman who'd fought for what mattered and won. The house that had kept secrets had finally revealed them all. And in doing so, it had set us all free. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.